6 tormented words, gasped by a shattered commander, didn't just cease a battle, they extinguished a nation. This recounts Robert E. Lee's unimaginable capitulation at Appomattox. But to fathom that moment, you must see the suffering that birthed it. Visualize Lee, crippled by dysentery, falling at Cold Harbor while woodlands blazed around him. Conceive Grant's troops surging into a butcher's yard of their own design, 12,700 men vanishing in hours. Behold Petersburg's trenches, 9 months of famine, inferno, and a reckless strike at Fort Stedman drowned in gore. And wonder, how does a general who routed forces twice his strength, who defied the Union for 4 savage years, reach where surrender cuts deeper than death? The truth lies in flame, plague, and Grant's pitiless battering across Virginia. This is the Army of Northern Virginia's final pulse. This is Appomattox's true price. Yet before we start, please like and subscribe to our channel to strengthen our community. Lee and his army had now finalized reorganization. James Longstreet's corps had reunited with them, returning from the Western Theater after Chattanooga's fall. The Confederacy and Lee now clutched one last strategy to end the war. It hung on the Army of Northern Virginia, enduring long enough that Abraham Lincoln might lose the 1864 vote, letting Democratic contenders George B. McClellan and George Pendleton secure a brokered peace if they won. Meanwhile, Union leadership had transformed. Though George Meade kept command of the Army of the Potomac, Henry Halleck had been dismissed as supreme commander of all Union armies. Ulysses S. Grant now held that role, choosing to base his headquarters directly with the Army of the Potomac rather than staying in Washington like his precursor. Confederate Generals Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill both insisted Grant would mirror prior Union commanders they'd beaten. Longstreet, however, objected. First, he'd recently come from the West, where troops under Grant's supreme command defeated him. Second, and more vital, Longstreet was Grant's closest confidant, and Grant had married Longstreet's cousin. His insight into Grant ran deep. Therefore, Lee determined to weigh all advice, but advance cautiously. On May 5, 1864, they engaged Grant and Meade at the Battle of the Wilderness. This signified the third occasion warfare consumed this ground. During fierce combat, the forest caught fire, trapping troops from both armies who perished in the blaze. Additionally, General Longstreet was wounded in circumstances eerily mirroring Stonewall Jackson, struck by friendly fire alarmingly near Jackson's fatal location. After 2 days of battle, the Army of the Potomac started retreating. To Lee's deep surprise, the soldiers marched south, not north. Later clashes produced either stalemates or Confederate defeats. Yet another factor emerged. General Lee had become gravely ill. Stricken by dysentery, his physical movement grew severely restricted. Consequently, Lee and his forces, abandoning intricate tactics against Grant and Meade, advanced to a small tavern near Mechanicsville, Virginia, arriving May 31st. This place was called Cold Harbor. Lee ordered Generals Jubal Early, Richard Anderson, and A.P. Hill to start building elaborate defensive works. Early stationed his men north of Shady Grove Road, stretching his position south toward Walnut Grove Road. Between his corps and Anderson's lay Pickett's division, or what remained of it, situated just south of Walnut Grove Road. Anderson arrayed west of Beulah Church, his works connecting southward with John C. Breckinridge's division called up as backup. A.P. Hill's corps secured the flank, its defenses ending at Turkey Hill. Lee's health again left him nearly immobile. The exact rationale remains obscure to historians. Nonetheless, Grant and Meade chose not to perform reconnaissance despite desperate appeals from commanders like Winfield Scott Hancock. Instead, they commanded the entire Army of the Potomac to execute a headlong frontal charge against the Confederate lines, believing the foe broken. The Union soldiers, however, advancing in ranks across open ground, were massacred. Southern rifle fire annihilated the assault waves. By June 7th, Lee and Grant agreed to a brief truce to recover the dead strewn across the field. Soldiers from both armies met across the battlefield, exchanging words. This interval was deeply affecting, reminiscent of the World War I Christmas armistice. The troops mingled cordially, sharing levity. Some Southerners even assisted Union men in recovering their deceased brethren. Federal losses exceeded 12,700, signifying the Army of Northern Virginia's crowning achievement in what became known as the Overland Campaign. They also scored a tactical victory against Union troops at Trevilian Station, Virginia on June 12th. Yet this campaign chapter essentially closed. Lee detected crucial movement. Grant's 125,000-man army had traversed the James River south of Richmond. Lee comprehended the target. Grant sought to seize Petersburg's vital rail hub, Virginia, permitting a straight thrust toward Richmond. Lee immediately directed his forces toward Petersburg. He concurrently directed General P.G.T. Beauregard, heading the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia, to obstruct Grant's progress. Beauregard's prompt action sparked a prolonged siege lasting 9 months. This operation ultimately erased winter encampment traditions from American military doctrine. Simultaneously, another Grant doctrine, total war, began unfolding. This approach brought hardship to Southern civilians. A principal, though not sole objective of total war, was provoking mass desertions. The reasoning was transparent. If troops sensed their kin endangered, they'd forsake positions to safeguard them. After 9 months of siege operations and continuous battle, featuring pivotal episodes like the Crater event, examined in depth in our Army of the Potomac feature, Lee engineered a final breakout gamble. By Lee's command, General Gordon struck Union works at a redoubt named Fort Stedman. Having personally toured the location and walked its parapets, observing the landscape reveals their absolute hopelessness. The offensive was fated to collapse. Lee then retreated his surviving units, striving to combine with General Joseph E. Johnston's army farther south. This initiated the concluding Appomattox operation. In the Third Petersburg engagement, General A.P. Hill, among Lee's most dependable lieutenants, fell. Lee's force persisted in skirmishing with Federal commands under Phil Sheridan and George Meade. On April 4, 1865, the Confederate capital, Richmond, was vacated and seized. Abraham Lincoln, successful in his re-election campaign, entered the abandoned city victoriously. On April 9th, the remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia arrayed for a last defense. As elements from the Army of the Potomac, Army of the James, and Army of the Shenandoah encircled them, Lee acknowledged the pointlessness. No practicable connection to Johnston survived. No tenable ground promised deliverance. Continued struggle was unfeasible. An aide from James Longstreet's staff bore Lee's communication to Grant, and combat halted. Many Confederate commanders beseeched Lee beforehand against capitulation, pledging to battle fatally. Lee answered that his sole option was to confer with General Grant, declaring, "I would perish 1,000 times." Following extended correspondence through dispatches, a rendezvous point was agreed. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant gathered at the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Lee consented to surrender conditions, drafted under Lincoln's direction and intentionally lenient, allowing Confederate troops and leaders to merely go home. Lee formally ratified the capitulation papers and fixed the timetable for relinquishing arms and regimental flags to the Army of the Potomac, honored by Grant as worthy of the distinction. On April 12, 1865, the surviving units of the Army of Northern Virginia initiated the formal surrender proceedings. Supervised by Brevet Major General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, Chamberlain named this occasion the Final Salute. Despite 4 years of fierce animosity, the Union forces showed deep reverence toward their foes. This ritual served as their ultimate assembly before dissolution and journeying homeward. Though the Army of Northern Virginia yielded, the broader war endured until May 26, 1865, when the last organized Confederate armies capitulated. The Army of Northern Virginia achieved exceptional martial feats throughout its service. It twice penetrated northern soil, crushed a foe double its size at Fredericksburg, and replicated this at Chancellorsville. Had Gettysburg concluded otherwise, history's trajectory might have shifted. Still, on April 12th, its 28,000 remaining troops began marching home, vanquished. As Chamberlain's last salute dimmed and 28,000 men turned toward desolate homesteads and torched towns, the Army of Northern Virginia vanished. Yet within that surrender tent, something new emerged, a legend, a phantom, a lost ideal that would outlast the Confederacy itself. Lee's army was defeated, but we still argue whether they were bested. Grant's clemency preserved lives, yet did it ignite generations of resistance? And when Lee murmured, "I would perish 1,000 times," was it disgrace, duty, or the sobering awareness that capitulation wouldn't conclude the conflict, merely this engagement? Thus, I pose this. On April 12, 1865, 28,000 broken soldiers laid down weapons at Appomattox. Yet when precisely did the South concede? In that courthouse, or within the tales we've recounted since? Contest your view below. History isn't penned by the conquered, but their specters linger long.